Okay, so now we have determined the image and we've collected some additional images that help describe the motif of the story, the world of the story. We know the theme, we know what the character or characters are going to learn. We know a symbol that's going to be created that's going to recur throughout the story. Now it's time to take a minute and we're going to think about the reader. How are we going to tell this story to the reader? I have some choices that I have to make about how this story is going to be written for my reader. And I think again about the age of my reader, and I think about the lesson that the characters learn, and I think about it for a little bit of time, and maybe I write some about it in my rough notes, and I have to decide how I'm going to tell this story. How am I going to write this story? Let's look at this PDF together. I have two things to decide. First, whether this happens in the present tense or whether it happens in the past tense. And I need to decide whose voice is going to be telling this story as I write it. So let's look at the choices that I have to make. I'm going to go with whatever choice you decide, so you've got to give this some good thought. Who is telling this story? Now, the third person point of view is also called the omniscient point of view, and it means that the entity that is describing this story knows everything. In my story that I've used as an example, I'm going to go with third person narrative because I want the narrator, the voice of the story, to know what Brenda's thinking, to know what Charlie's thinking, to be able to describe everything in adequate detail. So that's the way I'm going to go. But you can change your mind and go a different way. Third person is where the story is written from a perspective that's looking from the outside, but knows everything. And here's a little bit of information about the advantages of the third person. Whichever way I go, the most important thing is that I remain consistent. I can't change all of a sudden and go back to another point of view. So let's decide, maybe I want to tell this in the first person. I saw this. I did that. I was at the window. I saw this. Now, if I do that, let's say I want to write my story from Brenda's point of view. She's going to write this in first person. That means that she doesn't know what Charlie's thinking or feeling. She only knows what he does, what he says, and what is said about him. In a first person narrative, the character tells the story and tells the reader what that first person narrator wants the reader to know. For example, let's go back to that town that I was using in my example from before. Let's take a look at that together. Okay, so regardless of how I'm telling the story, whether it's third person or whether it's first person, as a writer, I'm going to describe this scene using words for my reader. Now remember, I'm only going to tell the reader what I want the reader to know. What the reader doesn't know is that just beyond this guy, there are trucks. Maybe there's a fight going on over in the distance. Maybe this is the end of the fence right here and there's nothing beyond that, so it really isn't the great big rodeo that it appears to be. Maybe it's just a little tiny rodeo ring. They exist. But as the writer of the story, I decide what the reader needs to know. You have total control of this world. And that's a responsibility, y'all. Creating a world and being consistent within that world and making sure that you describe for the reader exactly what you need the reader to see is a big responsibility. You can't let them down. You can't confuse your reader. If you create an element in the story, it needs to be dealt with. You can't just leave characters out there somewhere. If you create them, you have to deal with them. Now, if I decide that I'm going to go with a narrator, whether it's a first person or other kind of narrator, I have to make a decision. Is that narrator telling the truth? Or is that narrator not telling the truth? Again, I get to decide all those things myself. And I'm going to decide those by going back over here to these rough notes all the time and writing my ideas and writing my thoughts. Maybe I'm going to insert that right here and I'll show you how. And in my rough notes, I just write down what I'm thinking under the category of who is telling the story. And I put it in all caps so I can find it later. And I write, I thought about Brenda telling this in first person, but I don't think that's going to work because this really is Charlie's story. He's the one that learns the lesson. So the reader needs to know how Charlie thinks and how he feels. And I don't want Charlie to tell the story because I think he'd be an unreliable narrator. I don't think he'd tell the truth because he doesn't know what he's doing half the time. So I'm going to go with an omniscient narrator who sees all, knows all, and can describe truthfully and objectively the events that happen and let the reader feel what the reader feels based on the events. And I'm going to make it past tense because I like vintage pieces. And I'm going to make it a flashback. I'm going back over here to this handout, choosing the time and voice of the narrative. And I'm going to read what exactly a flashback is. And I'm going to go to Google and I'm going to do some additional research on my own, which I will save in my Works Cited page that I'm creating. And I'm going to learn about flashback. I love flashback technique, but I don't always use it. Or I can write it in the past tense. Past tense is a natural way of telling the story. Present tense is just hard as it can be. Hard. But I might do it. I've done that before because just to challenge myself. Present tense is so hard because you just find yourself going into the past tense so easily, and it takes a lot of editing. But I might do it in the present tense. Still, for this story, I'm going back to my rough note. I'm sticking with it. So what I like to do is I like to go in there and I just make it bold whenever I make a decision. All those other notes around it are all the other notes around it, but when I make a decision, I'm going to stick to it, and I'm going to go with a flashback. And I know that that means that I'm going to need to go and study how to flashback techniques and everything else. But when I go back and I look at this picture and I think about telling this story to my reader, it's important for me for this story to tell the reader the truth and to let them see the rodeo as Charlie and Brenda see the rodeo. As exciting, as thrilling, as energy, as everything that is not this little town that they want so much to not be part of, but they both learn in the end really is the heartbeat of their lives. Now you go over this choices list, make your decisions, write your notes in your rough notes, and do whatever you like to do when you make a decision. Either use bold or highlighter or something when you make a decision about how you're going to tell this story. Because this set of decisions here is so important for the reader to whom you have an obligation to tell a story that is complete and detailed. That concludes this tutorial on choosing the time and voice of your narrative.